Welcome to the Real Estate Syndication Show. Whether you are a seasoned investor or building a new real estate business, this is the show for you. Whitney Sewell talks to top experts in the business. Our goal is to help you master real estate syndication. And now your host, Whitney Sewell.
Are you a new or sophisticated investor wanting to learn how to operate a successful syndication business? For life-changing training from the nation's leading syndication expert, my friend Vinny Chopra has the training you need. Text LEARN, L-E-A-R-N, to 474747. This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Today our guest is Moses Kagan. Thanks for being on the show, Moses.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Moses is the co-founder and head of Adaptive Realty, the Los Angeles-based development and property management group. Since 2018, he has overseen the repositioning of 80 properties in Los Angeles and grown Adaptive from zero to $110 million of property under management. That's impressive. And he's licensed as a real estate broker in California. Moses, just from our conversation beforehand, I'm excited to have you on the show. And I just really appreciate your time and just sharing your expertise with the listeners. But, tell them who you are, a little more about where you're at and what your focus is right now. And let's dive into this different business model that you have and how you're crushing it.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much again for having me here, and really excited to talk to your listeners. So yeah, Whitney, as you said, our model is pretty unusual. First of all, I should say that we have renovated 80 buildings or so over the last 10 years in Los Angeles. We have 9 projects currently under renovation. Just to give you kind of a sense for the business. So we're actually, I think we're around 115 million in assets under management. And our property management company, which manages like about 650 units, half of which are ones that we own and half are owned by third parties. So that kind of gives you sort of a sense for the scale. We have an unusual strategy. So our business model is to buy really beat up old apartment buildings in about 5 or 6 neighborhoods in Los Angeles. We gut renovate the buildings, I should say. We vacate them entirely. We gut renovate them to the studs. We replace electric and plumbing and windows and roof, upgrade the foundation. We move walls, everything to kind of restore the building so that it lasts for a long time, and also kind of to optimize the square footage to maximize the rent per square foot. The result of that process is that we add a ton of value to the buildings. So much value that when the buildings are stabilized, we are able to refinance them using long-term bank debt and pull out anywhere between 80 and 100% of the capital employed. So the result is that we're generally earning, we and our investors, I should say, are generally earning kind of like in the low teens cash on cash returns on the capital that remains in the deal, all the way up to infinite. Like we have plenty of deals where we've pulled out 100, actually in one case 110% of the capital employed. So once you do that, obviously you own the building, your investors have all their money back, and you're just collecting cash flow forever. So and obviously in a situation like that, like why would you sell that? So all of our capital is permanent capital. We don't sell renovated buildings.
Nice. So, I'm excited about this model or learning a little more about it. And so so you're buying the buildings, and then, obviously they're very heavy renovations, and I want to get into that a little bit, but then, you're increasing the value so much that you can return investor capital. So pretty much you're paying them off. They're done with that deal, ready to invest in another deal with you, correct? Or are they staying in the deal?
They stay in the deal. They get their capital back, but they retain an ownership stake in the building. So,
nice.
The terms vary a little bit, but we use kind of a relatively standard real estate private equity model where investors kind of get usually like a 6 pref. And then once we return all their capital and the 6% pref we pay, then they own 70% of the building and we own 30% of the building.
Nice. And I wanted to say again, you talked about, you all have completed 80 properties, in the last 10 years. That's massive. To me, that's like, wow. I mean, that's a lot, And so, I guess, let's back up a little bit to, how you've done that. How have you successfully, continued to keep doing that,
Sure.
and some, help us to get there.
Yeah, well, so I guess the first thing to understand is that Los Angeles real estate is extremely attractive, right? Particularly multifamily, and particularly as you climb up the asset sizes, those buildings attract a lot of interest from players who basically have cheap capital, who have pension fund money or whatever. So if you're trying to generate supernormal returns, it makes sense, at least it made sense to us, to kind of focus on what I would call sub-institutional scale deals. So that's kind of like in the range of, let's say, 2.5 million on the low end, up to around 10 million on the high end. And so the nice thing is that those deals are like a little bit more complicated and capital intensive than what your standard like dentist who wants to just buy a building would do. But they're also way smaller than what an institutional real estate private equity fund would want to do. So the result is that you can generate, like, as I said, supernormal returns. The downside is that it's obviously a very inefficient way to place capital, right? Like you're doing like a $2.5 million deal here and a $5 million deal over there. It takes a really long time to place material amounts of capital. So what we wanted to be able to offer supernormal returns to our investors in order to justify the fee and ownership stake that we get. So it's like the question is, how do you square that circle? And the answer is that you figure out how to do a lot of projects at once. And so I have a partner, John Chris, who is licensed as a contractor. He is, without like meaning to sound at all obnoxious, if there's someone better at renovating small apartment buildings in Los Angeles, I've certainly not met him. So John is just an absolute wizard at running multiple construction projects at the same time. And because of that, and because I love doing deals, we've just kind of evolved between the two of us, and then eventually trained a bunch of employees who work for us to kind of be able to do a whole bunch of deals in parallel. As I said, beginning, like we're doing, I think, 9 right now, and we've done as many as 20 at a time before.
Wow.
Yeah. And these are not like lipstick on a pig type deals. It's not like, paint them and change the carpet or whatever. I mean, like gut renovate to the studs, like just, insulation, drywall, wiring, plumbing, you name it. I mean, it's really thorough renovations.
I guess, kind of quickly go through that. Like you close on a deal, you're gutting it down to the studs. How long is that process taking, for you? I don't know if you know it on like a per unit basis or so, size of the property, but how long does that take? Sure.
Well, one thing to say is that, we always renovate the entire building. In other words, we don't do unit by unit. And
so every deal is that way.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that means negotiating with tenants often to vacate them from the building. And then, so once the building is vacant, it generally takes us somewhere between 9 and 12 months to go through the whole process. It occasionally longer if it's a particularly large deal. And every once in a while we get lucky and, on a smaller one and it takes 6 or something like that. But the whole process going from the day we buy it until the day that we refinance a building is sort of like on the order of 18 months, give or take.
Okay. And so, I mean, obviously a major remodel, how are you growing teams? How did you grow teams to be able to do all this? Or are you hiring out a lot of that work and then you're managing other contractors, or are you employing a lot of these people?
Yeah, so we don't GC ourselves, and that was in the beginning I thought that we might, and John, as I said, got his license for that reason. It turns out that I think that that's not a great model for us, in part because, as I said before, we want to do a lot of projects at once. And with the best will in the world, like no GC is going to oversee 10 or 20 individual rehab projects. It's just not feasible. So, we were going to be forced to do some third-party GCing anyway. And then another thing to say is that, and I think this is very relevant to your listeners, I think that GCing your own deals creates some weird incentives and some incentive misalignment. So, a contractor almost by definition is sort of trying to do, this is going to sound not great, but like they're trying to do as little work as they can for whatever they're getting paid. And the flip side, obviously, is that the investors in a building want the most work that they can get for the money. And so we have found that it is better to set ourselves up as 100% pure advocates for the investors, who are, after all, our partners. And have true arm's length negotiations and relationships with the contractors. Now, that being said, we have a guy who has been renovating buildings for us since 2009, and to my knowledge has not worked for anyone else. I think he's done like 40 buildings or something. We have two other guys who have each done north of 15 buildings, certainly, for us. So we have very close contractor relationships, and we can get into why that's important. But at the end of the day, it is an arm's length relationship. So our job on our side is to oversee the design. We do the materials purchasing. We hire the contractors and oversee them, but we are not ourselves the contractors.
Okay. No, I appreciate you explaining that, elaborating. And it sounds like if somebody's done 40, remodels with you, somebody else, even at 15, they're a close part of your team.
They are. And, we do all kinds of things to try to help those guys out. We had one guy who, he had a worker have an accident on site, and he had some, workers' comp issues and all that stuff. And we literally just cut him a check that had nothing to do with any contract we had or any deal that was going on at the time. He's a guy who's done a lot of business with us, and he's an honorable guy, and we care about him and wanted him to stay in business and not, go back to the country that he's from. So John and I wrote a big check out of our own pockets to kind of make it okay for him.
Wow.
So I've been to some of these guys, like, family birthday parties and stuff. They don't work for us. And believe me, you can hear John screaming at them sometimes from the other side of the office. He's super tough on them. But at the end of the day, yeah, we depend on them to do good work quickly. And so those are long-term relationships.
Nice. So, you and I were talking a little bit before the show just about that first deal to building that sustainable business. And I appreciated, some of the analogies you used as well. And one of them was crawling through broken glass, I think is what you said.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to share a little bit of that with the listeners. I feel like it's valuable because, a lot of people see people in this business, that are, seem very successful. And it looks like it just kind of happened in the last year, and they think, oh, I'm going to go do that. But they don't see all these hardships and the crawling through the glass, as you talked about. And, I just thought maybe you could elaborate on that, that first deal to really building a great business like you have.
Yeah, no, it is a hard slog. And, and it's funny, probably like twice a week, people come to me and ask me, like, how'd you do? I got my first deal, or I think I'm about to do my first deal, but I've run the numbers, and I just, my wife is telling me, like, how do I, like, great, we're going to make $40K in fees, and like, we'll sell this thing 2 years from now, and I'm going to make another $70K, but I got 2 kids and a house payment or rent or whatever. Like, how do you do that? How do you build it into a full-time business? So I guess, yeah, as I said before, for us, it was like scratching and clawing. I got my brokerage license. So before we started Adaptive, we had done some deals. We didn't have any money when we started Adaptive. We had done some deals. I had my brokerage license. John had his contractor's license. So I was, in addition to doing the small number of deals that we could do with the capital that we could raise in the beginning, I was brokering deals. What happened was that a lot of the deals that I could find, I was representing buyers. I didn't want to cold call, and I knew a lot about buying buildings. So I basically ended up like sort of building a business representing buyers. And the problem was that these buyers I would show them a deal that was all beat up. And I'd be like, look, this is cheap on a per square foot basis, per unit basis. Like, you should buy this deal. And they're like, I don't have the first idea of what I would do with that building if we bought it. Like, congratulations, you found me a cheap deal, but like, I don't even know any contractors. So in the beginning, I would be like, hey, here's what we'll do. Like, I'll bring John in, and you pay him like sort of a consulting fee, and he'll oversee the renovations for you. And that kind of worked. And then John and I decided, hey, look, I'll split my brokerage commission with you. You split your construction consulting fee, let's call it, with me. And what that evolved into was basically like a fee development business. So there were all these deals that we could see that were good deals, but we just didn't have the capital to do them. And so we basically found a bunch of clients who were willing to pay us like, $100,000 eventually, like maybe 150 grand to do the whole process on these buildings and not have ownership. So, I mean, it was so awful. And looking back on it, I mean, we renovated all these buildings for people, and almost all of which we still manage, and the buildings are great and the rents are way up. And basically our fee was effectively free by the time you take into account how much value we added to the project. I mean, like what they were paying us was like a rounding error. But that allowed us, by stacking a bunch of those projects on top of each other, that allowed us to live while we were building up our capital base. The network of investors who would ultimately go on to capitalize our future deals.
You had long-term in mind there, didn't you? I mean, you were building that investor base and putting in the time and making it happen.
Yeah. And I think that that's like an important thing to understand about the business. Like at least with us, I mean, I don't want to speak for other people, but people always get horrified when I say this, so I'm going to watch to see if you cringe. I am going to die behind a desk like this one, if it's not this one. Like, I love this business, and I will do this, as long as I am able. And so knowing that has been freeing in a way, because it's very clear what you should do, right? Like, you don't cut corners. You put the investor's interest before your own, because I'll give you an example. We bought a deal with this investor, and we ended up getting the opportunity to buy the deal next door. And the original deal, there were some reasons why it isn't going to work out as well as we'd hoped. But luckily the deal next door is going to be great. And so we're just kind of going to offload the first one. And, it's not a great result from our perspective. It happens very infrequently, but bad luck, it happened on this one. So John and I are going to eat the losses for that. It's like the investor is going to lose, or let's say the LLC is probably going to lose like $50K or something like that. Not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but John, that's going to come out of John and my pocket. And not because the investor wouldn't pay it, and certainly not because it's in the docs. It's not in the docs. But it's look, this guy trusted us enough to buy the first deal, and then he trusted us enough to double down and buy the next deal. And he's in our funds, and we want to have a lifelong relationship with this guy. So obviously we put him in a deal that didn't work out great. We're going to make it right for him. And so once you decide that you're going to be doing it forever, and that those investor relationships are going to be forever, it's pretty clear how you should act. Same with the city and tenants, and you just you think about it I'm going to be sitting here doing these deals with the same inspectors 10 years from now and 20 years from now. And you can get away with something once or twice, but if you but then you're going to get busted, and then your relationship with that person is over, and you're going to be seeing them again for the next 3 decades. So we've always built the business from the perspective of this is going to be a long-term thing. I'll give you another example. I always knew that to stabilize the platform, in other words, we always wanted to be in a place where we didn't have to do a deal, right? Where we weren't dependent on the fees from any particular deal, so that if the market sucked, we just could sit on our hands for a while. And so I knew that to do that, we were going to have to build a property management business, because the property management fees are kind of a recurring, smooth revenue stream that allows you to make payroll. Like I said, we have, I think, 10 employees now. But in the beginning, when we were building the business, we kept the property management in-house, even though at the beginning, we only had, 10, 20, 50, 100 units, and we would lose money on the property management. So every month we would take those precious deal fees that were coming in from those deals where we didn't even have ownership, and we would use it to pay payroll for employees who were managing the buildings that we didn't own. So we're I'm sitting there, John and I, we're like broke and we're subsidizing property management for rich people, right? Like, which did not feel great. But over time, as the size of the property management portfolio grew, both because we did a good job and the third parties referred other people and they bought more buildings, et cetera, and because we were buying more and more of our own deals, eventually the property management business became big enough to be break even and eventually profitable. But again, like that was a long slog to get there, but it's one that kind of we always knew we had to do, and it's really paid off for us.
How did you stay motivated through that? Just through that, really the hard times. You referred to it earlier as crawling through broken glass. How do you keep going? When it's that tough, because I know a lot of the listeners are even before that stage. They're just seeing these other people with great success and are not anticipating it taking all that time or all those hours and that difficulty. And how did you keep pushing?
It's a really interesting question, and let me double down on it by saying, I went to Princeton and London School of Economics, and I got a ton of friends who were very, very successful, like out of the gate, starting in their early 20s. So I'm sitting there, like, I guess I started Adaptive. Like I said, we had done a few deals before Adaptive, but we really started Adaptive in 2012. I was already 32. And like I said, like pretty broke. And I had my first kid was already born. And it was terrible. It was not good. My best friends in the world were getting rich, and I was broke. And I guess one thing to say is that there's this question of opportunity cost, right? It's like people are like, well, how did you stick by it? Like it was so hard. It's like it was 2012. Like what job was I going to get? There weren't like a ton of amazing jobs that were for someone like I had washed out of investment banking and like kind of messed around with a tech startup. And so I knew I didn't want to really work for anyone else. And if I was willing to work for someone else, it would have been like going and taking a job that I didn't want, like one that wouldn't pay me as much. So there wasn't really an option in my mind. It was just like, look, like, there's a slog here, and we're just going to keep doing it. And I guess another thing to say is that we always had a long-term vision in mind, but it's really just about doing the deal in front of you. Go sit there and look at every single deal that's on the market until you find one that is good, and then run like crazy to do that one. And then as soon as that's done, do that again, and then do it again and do it again. And just like, sit there and chop wood. And that's kind of, and don't think too much. Like, that you're making money in each deal. It's going to take a long time to get into the promote, but like you're getting some fees and you're paying your bills, and you just keep doing it day after day after day. You look up one day and it's, X number of years later, and it's like, oh, whoa, we actually have done a lot of buildings now.
Wow. I appreciate the mindset too of like, it just wasn't an option to quit. You mentioned it wasn't an option. We just had to keep going and doing the deal in front of you and sit there and chop wood. I like that analogy as well. Just keep your head down and keep moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you ask John what he admires in me, like being really honest, John is like one of these people who like needs action. So he's out at construction sites all day and arguing with people and driving around. Whatever. I am perfectly fine to sit at my desk from whatever o'clock until whatever o'clock and look at every single deal. And I will, like, obviously at this point I can tell pretty quickly if we're going to be willing to do something, but like, there's just no substitute for that, because every once in a while, like, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I know I know because I've been doing it for a long time that it will happen. You just find stuff that's mispriced. Like, and the more you do, and the more confident you are in what the numbers look like, the more, the quicker it jumps out at you that something is mispriced. And then, but it's like suddenly you just kind of like get where you're like, you sort of see the matrix, but you have to just keep staring at deal after deal. And suddenly you're like, bang, like that's a deal. And then you run like crazy to try to get it.
Nice. I like that. And that also, just complements your all's team and your partnership, your different roles too.
Sure.
Tell me, how do you all communicate within your team? And obviously we're about out of time. We're gonna have to move on, but how do you all communicate? How do you all keep all this going? You're focused over here. He's focused, on that. How do you all keep all the projects happening?
That's a great question. We have so our offices are next to each other. There's a window separating them, so we have it open most of the time. He's not there all day. Look, we have one big team meeting at 12:30 every Tuesday, where the whole company gets together and talks through every single project that we have on. John and I probably have a morning catch-up call, and then probably once or twice a week we have lunch together. But we're at the point where we trust each other. We once we kind of buy a deal and we have a deal memo and we know what we're going to do, there's every once in a while there's a decision that needs to get made and we're each other's best sounding board. But, I don't need to hear the ins and outs of what's going on with the contractors and stuff all day. That's kind of like why I have a partner. And I'm sure he feels the same way with me. And we just have to trust each other that we're spending our time in a reasonable way. And obviously the results kind of speak for themselves.
Yes. No, I like that. Yeah. And if you don't have trust in one another, then you shouldn't be partnered anyway.
Yeah. You don't know. You don't need, life is way too short to work with people who you don't trust.
So, in this business, this apartment and syndication, raising capital, all these things that we have to do or know how to do and do well to be successful in this business, Moses, what's been the hardest part for you?
In the beginning, it was definitely the capital raising part. And I would say so I used to have this mindset, right, where I would be like, our deals are so good. Why do I have to go and pitch people for capital? They should just be banging down the door. Obviously the numbers are insane. Why aren't they just calling me? And I was kind of resentful about that. And that is obviously a totally self-defeating and stupid way of looking at the world. And I would just be I guess I'm just not a good capital raiser. And it's hey, ding dong, you're in the most capital intensive business in the world. You don't get to just be I'm not a good capital raiser. You need to figure out how to raise capital. And for me, that was a real process. It was really about, I started writing a blog that I still write. I've been writing since 2011 or something. That brought capital partners in. I put my hand up and said, hey, I'm willing to speak at conferences. I have participated in podcasts, followed up with people, asked for referrals. I've taken God knows how many meetings I've taken, to try to raise money that, they didn't work out. But what happens is if you know what you're doing and you talk to enough people, not in a salesy, obnoxious way, but just in a cut and dried, here's what we do. And we think you're going to like it kind of way, you kind of attract the investor base that you deserve. And what happened with us is our deals are my approach is maybe a little bit more cerebral and a little less kind of backslappy than most people. I'm not, I don't play golf or I'm not in a country club or whatever. But what we have done is attracted an investor base that's a bunch of partners at private equity funds and and people who are themselves particularly successful real estate investors. And like I said, you get the investor base you deserve. But for me, that was really a process of learning and growing.
That's great. Yeah. And it's not if you're too salesy, it pushes a lot of people away, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. You want to at every turn, you want to be I'm okay with you not moving forward. If you don't want to do this, you always have to, even from the very beginning, I guess that's another thing. We're talking about building for the long term. Even when I was brokering, I would tell people not to do deals, even when we were even when I was broke and I stood to get a $20,000 commission check, which God knows I needed. If we found something in the diligence that would make me not want to buy the building, I made a point of just telling my clients not to do it. And sometimes they wouldn't obviously I wouldn't be hey, I'm an apartment building expert. By the way, I'm broke. So they didn't know I was broke. So you know what I mean? But so you can't be hey, I'm broke and I'm telling you not to do this deal. But I would just, so it was painful inside, but you just have to kind of say, what are people going to think of me? I couldn't imagine getting someone to buy a building that I knew had problems with it. And they come back to me 6 months or a year later and why'd you sell me that building? So it's just I think for me anyway, sales is very much about doing the opposite. It's about talking about the downside and making sure people understand what the risks are. And then hopefully the numbers are good enough that people, despite being fully informed of what the risks are willing to move forward.
It's relationships and having the long-term in mind, doesn't it?
Totally.
And so what's a way that you all have recently improved your business that we could apply to ours?
Oh man, this is a really good one. And this is, this is one of these things where like John and I, like when John was the one who figured it out, and like we both want to just like punch ourselves in the face for not having done it until now. It's just like, it's so obvious. So we
Oh, I
used to,
can't wait to hear it.
so it's a little esoteric, but anyone who does rehab deals is going to get it right away. So we'd buy a building and then we would negotiate with the tenants to move out. And then like, however long later, like a few months or whatever, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it was, 6 months later, the tenants would move out. And then we would go in and we would start doing our design process, right? Which like do the as-builts, like get measurements of the building taken and then start taking it through the city. And that probably takes, whatever, 2, 3 months of permitting. So it would sometimes be like 6 months from when we bought the building until we were, or even longer until we were ready to start our construction. At one point, John looks at me and he's like, why don't we just like spend the $500 and have the drawings made while we're doing our initial inspections? So that then you can run the city permitting process, at the same time that you're hoping to vacate the building, thereby saving yourself like 2, 3 months of screwing around with an empty building. And it was like, I mean, it seems like obvious in retrospect, but if you think about it, like we made that mistake over probably like 70 buildings, costing ourselves like, I don't know how much preferred return that we ended up having to pay those investors for having each of those buildings sort of sit there for 2, 3 months, not earning any cash flow.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, super obvious, small thing, but it's like, think about trying to organize your processes in parallel so you don't waste time.
Nice. Appreciate you sharing that. And what's your best advice for taking care of investors?
Oh, well, like I said, I mean, it's all, there's a concept in game theory, right? Like if you study that in college or whatever, and it's like about the distinction between one-time games and multiple games. So if you're playing a game with someone once, right, and it's just like win or lose, obviously you do whatever you can and to make sure you win and the other guy loses. But once you realize that your relationship with investors is like a permanent thing, it's a totally different game. You're playing a multi-iteration game. And so in that game, it's not like try to screw over the other guy so you win. It's like, how do we figure out how to make sure that we both win? Because we're going to keep doing this over and over and over and over, and we can do better by collaborating. And that's really, I guess, that's what it comes down to. It's just like, just think about those people who trust you with capital. Capital is precious. In a world where income is taxed for your highest earners, in California, high earning people can pay north of 50% of their income to state and federal taxes. Okay, think how hard it is to accumulate capital in that situation. If that dentist who you're talking to, who can write a $500K check or whatever for your deal, he bled for that money. Right, like he had to earn $1 million. He had to have all of his other expenses taken care of, and then he had to earn $1 million to pay $500K in taxes to have that $500K that he's going to share with you. And that capital is precious, and so those relationships are precious, and they're not to be taken lightly. And so you got to just think of those investors and their capital as gold, and you got to do everything you can do really to deliver what you said you were going to do. And then when you screw up, you got to take responsibility for it to try to make it right for them.
Great. That's some great advice. And I appreciate you talking about just how hard that person's worked for that money, because that's something we don't think about. I think sometimes they're in the industry, like that's their hard earned money and they're trusting you with, with all that time they've spent and work, to make that happen.
No, I think it's not until, I mean, it's funny. It's like later on in your career, once you start to get a little bit more successful and you start to write those big checks to the IRS, then you're like, oh man, generating capital is really hard. And you're like, like, maybe I ought to treat those people well,
Wow. So what's been the number one thing that's contributed to your success, or something we haven't talked about?
Well, that's a great question. Honestly, I have a network of friends, and I guess family of friends who I've made along the way, in high school and college and a little bit after college. And those people were the ones in the beginning who were willing to back me to a greater or lesser extent when I didn't have a track record. Now, like, you know, and by the way, many of them are still investors with us, and we, you know, for the rest of time, you know, even if, you know, when I have a 500K minimum check, a minimum fund, like if one of those guys wants to write a 50K check, I'm taking it, even though 50K is not what I want to take, because they trusted us from the beginning and we're always going to take care of them. But now, you know, like now it's, you know, most of our money comes from people who write 7-figure checks. Most of our capital comes from people who write 7-figure checks. But I'll just never forget those people. You know, my friend Courtney's mom wrote a 100K check to Adaptive Realty Fund 1 when we didn't have a track record. We didn't know what we were doing. And she wasn't in Los Angeles. She didn't have a view. I don't think she read the documents. But she knew me since I was 15 years old, and she knew that I was going to do everything possible not to screw up and lose her money. And trusted me, and that goes for every one of those early investors. And so that, I mean, honestly, like we're smart, and we try to be honest and do the right thing and everything. But you know, it really took a bunch of people making a pretty big leap of faith with us in the beginning, and we'll never forget that.
Nice. And Moses, you know, how do you like to give back?
That is a really interesting question. Well, so you know, one thing I did recently is raised a bunch of money for the wrestling program at the high school that I went to. Both John and I were actually wrestlers, and actually a bunch of the money that helped us get started came from people who I met that way. So that's a financial thing that we did that I feel proud of. But actually, you know, one of the things that I've done very recently is I've kind of noticed among, I don't know if you want to call them like Gen Z or whatever, like basically the youngest people right now who are kind of like in college or just out of college. I've just like noticed that a lot of them are really kind of negative about capitalism in general. Like they just kind of like, they got big student loans. They don't feel like the world's working for them. And I get why they say that and everything, but it just, when I look around at the real estate business in particular in Los Angeles, it's just like, man, it is bursting with opportunity. There are brokers making millions of dollars a year. You can start your own company. There's a whole world of opportunity out there, but these kids are not seeing it. So what I've done recently, and I'm going to continue to do more of that, is I've asked, there's a program called Beat the Streets here, which is like a program that provides like wrestling coaching to disadvantaged like middle school and high school kids. And I know the guy who runs the program a little bit, and I've had him sort of like refer kids to me who are pretty mature and like self-starting kids. And I just sort of like started to talk to them about what those opportunities are. Like what can you do? No one ever told them that when their apartment building or the one down the street gets sold, some broker made $50,000 for doing 60 days of work. Like no one ever told them that world exists. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of talk to them about that world, and then try to introduce whatever part of it they're interested in, whether it's property management or loans or brokerage or whatever, trying to kind of introduce them to people who are in the business who can maybe give them a shot and kind of take them under their wing. So it's a long answer, but trying to serve as kind of like a clearinghouse for opportunity for kids like that.
Wow. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for sharing that as well, and putting, investing back into those kids. That's awesome. And Moses, you've been an amazing guest. I really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise and just this different business model than most of the time we hear about, and how you've been successful at it. But tell the listeners how they can learn more about you and get in touch with you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I think probably the easiest thing is to check out my blog. It's kagansblog.com. So KAGANSBLOG, kagansblog.com. And my contact information's on there. And God, I mean, if any of your listeners have like sleeping problems, I can recommend like going through like a few hundred of my blog posts, and it'll knock them right out. But no, in all seriousness, it's like, it's basically a journey. I think I've been writing it since I started Adaptive. So you really can see, us learning and growing and all the numbers and pictures. And it's really like kind of charts my education in the business as much as anything else. And I think it'd be pretty interesting to some of your listeners.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Moses. And thank you again for your time and being on the show. I appreciate the listeners being with us today and every day. And I hope you all will be with us tomorrow. I hope you'll go to the Facebook group, the Real Estate Syndication Show, and go to LifeBridge Capital and connect with me. I'm happy to help you any way I can. And I hope you'll connect with Moses as well. And I look forward to speaking with you in the future. And we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Awesome. Thanks, Whitney.
Thank you for listening to the Real Estate Syndication Show, brought to you by LifeBridge Capital. LifeBridge Capital works with investors nationwide to invest in real estate, while also donating 50% of its profits to assist parents who are committing to adoption. LifeBridge Capital, making a difference, one investor and one child at a time. Connect online at www.lifebridgecapital.com for free material and videos to further your success.